innovation. China has been investing both in the public sector and in the private sector. As was mentioned today, the total investment by public and private sources now amounts to about 1.4% of GDP. There you can see China's public expenditure relative to Japan, the European Union and the United States, still lower but increasing over time. Secondly, if we look at business expenditure, you see a very large increase in the recent years. So China now is approaching the European Union in terms of the percentage of GDP that it's actually spending in the business sector on R&D. These inputs are very important. Let's have a look at some of the individual companies. What I think is interesting here is when we look at the top 1,000 companies in the world in terms of R&D spending, there are a few Chinese companies that rank very high. They tend to be in the basic infrastructure and raw materials sections: China Railway, China Communications, PetroChina, China Coal. When we look at some of the companies that we think of as advanced leaders in technological development, such as Huawei, Huawei is very strong, but it's only 14th in the world. It's still a very substantial position. But when we look at some other companies, such as Lenovo, it's 68th, and then if we look at some other companies, we see that they're further down. So investment is happening, and that's very good, but there is obviously further to go. Let's now look at some of the outcomes of innovation, because innovation that is undertaken expresses itself in several ways. Ultimately, as was explained by our panel earlier today, it's in the application of products for people's benefit. But an intermediary step, of course, is the production of scientific articles. If you look at the production of scientific articles in the top world journals, China's share varies quite a lot by sector. Here's the overall figure, and you can see that China has just recently overtaken Japan. The data is for 2007, so it's 5 years old, but China is now producing more scientific articles than Japan, but still a lot less than the US or Europe. But if we look at particular sectors, China is very strong and growing very rapidly in chemistry and physics. You can see it's replaced Japan. It's approaching very close to the USA position. And if we look at engineering and mathematics, we see a similar story. So the basis for development of innovation is happening very fast. If we look at patents, which is another measure of output, we find that China is actually quite low in this respect. And this is interesting because we know that Chinese companies are amongst the largest in the world in terms of the total number of patents that they take out. In fact, China, I think, is now the largest in total terms. But most of those patents are taken out in the Chinese patent system. Very few are taken out in the international patent system. And why is that important? Well, if you're focusing solely on the domestic market, domestic patents are probably okay. But if you're planning to become an international competitor, you need to be patenting in the international system to protect yourself against other global competitors. Companies like Huawei are doing that. But as you can see, at present, as a whole, only about 5% of the international patents are being taken out by Chinese companies. So there's a big step there, I think, also, reflecting what was said earlier about intellectual property protection. Chinese firms are going to be wanting to protect their IP as they go into international markets more extensively. Now, let's think about what enterprises can do to innovate. Some of the advantages that I think we see with Chinese companies are that they're fast. They're fearless. They jump into areas quickly. They're willing to experiment. They're willing to fail fast. And this is what we're often told by innovating companies that help innovators, that it's good to experiment. You should throw out innovations, see if they work, learn from failure, and move on. They're good at learning and adapting. Perhaps China has forgiving customers who don't have such long legacies of experience with other firms that they're willing to give a company a second chance. They have cost advantages we've spoken about. They do understand customer micro-segments. There's a fierce pressure to survive, and I think that's very important for innovation. And smaller companies are pretty entrepreneurial. But I think one point that's very important to make here is that the company's experience in China has been primarily with what one would call incremental innovation, rather than radical breakthroughs. I personally think that that's quite appropriate for China. It's been appropriate in the past because the marketplace has demanded innovations that are essentially based on product development somewhere else in the world. And Chinese firms have been very good at imitating, and I believe that is a sensible step, not only in terms of use of resources, but also because, as Professor Guo said this morning, you have to have a basis of innovative capacity before you can come up with radical breakthrough innovations, and I think that is certainly happening. Here's some examples very quickly. I won't go through them in great detail. Some of the companies that we've seen is Suzhou, a microtech company that's producing nanoparticles, BYD that has changed its process of manufacture, Guangzhou Crane, Chint using customization to make products at a low cost. These are examples, I think, primarily of incremental innovation. They're not great breakthroughs, but those companies are developing the capacity to make breakthrough innovations in the future. We must also remember that companies often innovate in the business model. Haier is well known for its ability to respond and use lean manufacturing and integrated value chain. Tencent has developed its online gaming as a response to piracy in software products. Four Dimensions Johnson, a very interesting company based in Beijing that has gone into the production of very specialized vehicles for cash transit, ambulances, and done so by customizing part of the production here, using low-cost Chinese manufacturer, using standardized panels, and then sending them to Europe and having them assembled there so that customers get pretty close to a customized product. Very interesting innovations in the business model. So what are the challenges I think these companies have? We see a lot happening, but I think there are challenges in going to the next step, which is the more disruptive innovation. People often say China doesn't have a Steve Jobs, and I'll come back to that at the end. But a Steve Jobs, I think, is a person who has worked in a company that has produced innovations that are very disruptive, but are based largely on existing technologies. And as was said earlier in one of the sessions this morning, to come up with a disruptive innovation, you have to have an understanding, perhaps, of needs that customers don't realize they have. So these are some of the problems. Managing complex systems, I think, is a factor. Weak brands, dependence on the domestic market may make companies complacent about innovation. Past successes have been mainly incremental, as I mentioned. And today, global competition means that your innovations have to be kept up to date and very close to the cutting edge. Now, the sector in China that has been very successful in this regard, in my view, is the sector that has been part of the global supply chains. The information technology, telecommunications, those sectors, consumer electronics, have been integrated into global supply chains, not getting much benefit from it, as was pointed out this morning, but nevertheless, in order to compete in those sectors, they've had to be able to keep at the cutting edge of incremental innovation. So they are doing much more innovation than the state-owned sector. And that leads me towards the end of my session here, which is to say that what do we need to do? If we compare very successful Chinese companies with companies that have been not so successful, and this data is based on Hong Kong-based Chinese companies, not mainland companies, we see that Chinese firms tend to pursue very focused objectives. They tend to focus on market growth, increasing market share, building brand. Those are very commendable. But if we look at the behavior of multinationals, as we saw earlier today, multinationals tend to have a much broader range of objectives, each one of which contributes to the strength of the company longer term. So I would suggest that some of the things that Chinese firms have to do is to broaden their set of objectives in creating customer footholds in new markets, and top management is absolutely critical in this. We have an entrepreneurial company here where the leader of the company is committed to innovation, but that's not true in every other company. So that top management commitment is critical, and it means not micromanaging what your people are doing, but supporting them. Organization